Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Thursday Morning Torah, the Torah that happens only on Thursday morning. I don't know. I don't really have a tagline for this. I should have a tagline. Welcome to Thursday Morning Torah, the time when we gather to study Torah on Thursday morning. No, I still don't have a tagline. All right. Nonetheless, you are here, and I'm glad you are. And I want to talk about actually a few different things this morning. First of all, because we have a very rich Parsha to start off with, Bishalach, and I'll talk about why it's so rich in a moment. But also, as it happens, Monday is Martin Luther King Day, and also to Bishvat. And I'd like to at least say a word. I'm not going to give you a whole long spiel, but at least a word about all of these various celebrations, and I hope that you'll watch the Martin Luther King streaming tribute that we have from Sinai Temple with Craig Taubman and lots of other wonderful performers and singers, which will be on Monday at 5 o'clock. You can watch it here on our Sinai Temple YouTube site and so on. The Parsha of Bishalach is notable for two different related reasons. One is that this is when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. And of course, that's a huge, I would say three different reasons maybe. One is that they crossed the Red Sea, which is of course a huge event in the biblical narrative. But also it's when after they cross the sea, they sing Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. And that's why this Shabbat is often called Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat of a song, because singing and songs, which is something that we'll talk about in a second, play a significant role in the history and liturgy of this Torah portion. I suppose that it's very fitting in some ways that this comes around the time that we memorialize Dr. King, because the Exodus and the paradigm of the Exodus played an extremely important role, both in the Black slave culture and desire for liberation, and songs and stories about liberation from slavery in the States, and also during the Civil Rights Movement. The paradigm of the Exodus was very important, and in Dr. King's own personal speaking and writing. So the idea of being enslaved and being free, which the Exodus gave the world the paradigm for, of course, became extremely important in our own nation. And therefore, to be reading this at this time is I think, beautiful and important. I also want to detour to the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, which is not, it's not a major holiday in the Jewish calendar. It's basically the New Year for trees. It's an agricultural holiday, but the symbolism of the tree, as you may know, in the Jewish tradition is deep and significant. The Torah is called Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. Remember that the tree of life is the tree that Adam and Eve were not permitted to eat from in the Garden of Eden. And then subsequently, God gives you a tree of life, which is the Torah. And the Psalms begin with this image that the righteous person is ke'etz shatul al palge mayim. They are like a tree planted beside still water. In other words, deep roots, branches and leaves, constant fruit. That paradigm of a tree compared to a righteous person, I think, ties up all of this very beautifully with Dr. King, with Tu B'Shvat, and with Parshat Bishalach. So that is the mini sermon of the morning, of Thursday Morning Torah. And now let's look at the actual Torah portion and talk a little bit about its features. And here I'm going to highlight, I think, three of them. One is the conclusion of the slavery in Egypt. We've had now the first Pesach, or at least the instructions for the first Pesach, the slaying of the firstborn, and now the Israelites flee Egypt. And yet, remarkably enough, even after all of the anguish and death and destruction, Pharaoh is not prepared to surrender. And this is confusing, at least. And the only analogy that I can think of historically that actually bears some real connection is the bombing at Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. That after the initial bomb, there still was not surrender. And a second bomb is what finally sealed it. Now, maybe there would have eventually been surrender. This is a big historical debate, and I don't want to get into it, and I certainly have no expertise in the area. But it reminds you that sometimes even utter defeat will not persuade the defeated to give up. And you cannot imagine that Pharaoh thought, well, after these plagues, running after them will work. What did he imagine would happen? And yet, the Israelites come to the sea, and there are the hoofbeats of Pharaoh, and then you get the splitting of the sea, which, of course, according to Jewish tradition, what happens is that Moses doesn't know what to do, and he stretches his staff out, but the sea doesn't really split until Nachshon jumps in, and the idea that you must leap into the sea to cause it to split, that you have to take that leap, which, by the way, has a parallel in Roman mythology. I don't know if you're aware of it. Curtius jumps into a big hole opens in the Roman Senate, and Curtius jumps into the hole and it closes, which I suppose is the opposite mythology, but the same idea, that somebody has to sacrifice themselves or be prepared, because Nachshon doesn't die, be prepared to sacrifice themselves in order to effectuate a giant change in the nature of things. And this idea then, which is found in the Midrash, not in the Torah, this idea then is that Israel can be sparked by this one heroic act, as happens later in different ways with different people. And we come then to the Song of the Sea after the Israelites pass through. And those of you who looked at the Jerusalem Post column know that I gave a lot about song in the Jewish tradition. And some of it was taken, I will confess to you, from a book that I wrote years ago called In Speech and in Silence, The Jewish Quest for God. It's about words and speech and silence and song in Jewish history, and the way in which all of them interact in our seeking God. And song is clearly a central and important part of the way in which we reach towards God, in part because song, unlike speech, which you really can't do with others, song you can do together. People can sing together. And music has a quality of elevating the spirit in a way that almost nothing else, maybe nothing else does. You can give the most beautiful sermon in the world, and it's not as deeply moving as a beautiful piece of music. There is something in music and in song, in the combination of words and music, that when you read lyrics on a page, they do not have the effect that they have when lyrics are together in song. And that's part of, Shirat Hayam, even though it's called a shir, because shir in Hebrew is a poem as well as a song. It's the same word for poetry and for song. But Shirat Hayam loses for not being sung on the page. We can't imagine exactly what it sounded like, but nonetheless, the song is a song essentially of victory. There are some features of it which are very interesting. I mean, scholars of biblical literature think that the song is among the earliest compositions in all of the Bible, because remember that it doesn't only refer to what happened in Egypt. It's not only about chariots drowning in the sea. It says, agony grips the dwellers in Philistia, the clans of Edom are dismayed, the tribes of Moab, trembling grips them, and the dwellers in Canaan are aghast. Now that's all about people that the Israelites haven't even met yet, right? Namu, Kol Yoshvei Canaan, those, what do the Canaanites have to do with anything? Why are they melting or aghast? They will find out about the Israelites after the Israelites enter the desert. Now, you could say that the word of the escape, as seems to be the case with Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, that the word reaches him about what happened. You could say that the word of the escape reached, all the way to Canaan, but it does sound as though the song is either anticipating, or if it was looking back, reporting on events later on. However, either way, all of the chariots and so on drown at the sea, and Miriam begins to play, and the women go out with her and dance. So it's not only song, it is also dance. And it is and I want to say also, when people talk about how it's a rejoicing in the sufferings of others, and this, as you know, is part of the Passover Seder, that God tells the angels, why are you singing while my creatures are drowning? And we take 10 drops out of the cup for each of the plagues. It's deeper than that. It's rejoicing that slavery is over, that they're no longer under the subjugation of people. They're not just, and their lives were saved, because obviously many of them would have died had Pharaoh's troops reached them. So it is a celebration of the death of oppression as much as a celebration of the death of the oppressor. And it's hard to begrudge people who were slaves being joyous and singing when the slave owner is vanquished. And that is certainly part of the story here. However we feel about it, that is part of the story. Therefore, they set out from Elim, and bread comes from the sky, bread being manna comes from the sky, and the Israelites eat it, and then they complain. And this is also a remarkable thing. I drew an analogy which not everybody was fond of, and you may not be fond of it either, but you understand the purpose of the analogy. It's not to make a perfect analogy. I talked about the fact that, here is this miracle. And it's hard to believe that after all these miracles, all the plagues and the splitting of the sea and the manna, the first thing the Israelites do is complain. But I remember very well when we were all sitting around and we prayed for the miracle of a vaccine. Let them just make a vaccine. And nobody thought that the vaccines would come as quickly as they did. Remember that. And then as they came, so many people's first reaction was, this is too quick. This can't be good. And there is something of an analogy in that there is no beneficence that human beings can be given where they won't at the same time feel aggrieved and grumble about it and be upset about it. And if you don't like the analogy of the vaccine, take the analogy of the state of Israel. Remarkable miracle. Did it stop people complaining? No, it did not. Or the analogy of, just the life that we live, most of us, compared to the lives of our ancestors, where we have modern medicine and indoor plumbing and modern dentistry and on and on and on. I mean, the poorest person in the United States lives in a way that an ancient king couldn't have dreamed of. And yet, we all complain, even those of us who live good lives. So this is built in as a feature of human nature. And it is amazing, but not surprising. How about that? Amazing, but not surprising. Which goes back to an old story that my father told me many years ago, the distinction. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a story about Noah Webster, the creator of Webster's Dictionary, who apparently was married, but how do we put this delicately in a Torah class, but was caught in flagrante delicto, in other words, in bed with another woman by his wife, who walked in. She exclaimed, "Noah, I'm surprised." And he said, "No, my dear, you are amazed. It is we who were surprised," thereby making the distinction between the two words. So it is amazing, but perhaps not surprising, that we react to miracles oftentimes by still complaining about the miracles that we don't get, as opposed to the miracles that we do. And we are even aware of it. People will often say to me, "I lost my parent. They were 97 years old, lived a good long life, but I still wasn't ready." And shouldn't be this way. Because we have a built-in sort of loss meter that registers losses as more powerful in many ways than blessings. And that's a reality of human nature. It's not a fault of an individual. It's a reality of human nature that we all suffer from and have to be aware of. And it doesn't matter that you had a great lunch. If dinner is lousy, dinner is lousy. And that's on display here right after the Israelites crossed the sea. It's like, yes, you gave us plagues. Yes, you split the sea. Yes, you rained manna down on us. No, we want other food. And there you have it. As the old Yiddish phrase puts it, Jews are like other people, only more so. And here is a good example of that. Having said so, this also marks a giant shift that we should be, we are aware of, but I want to articulate it, a giant shift between the world of Egypt, which is where the Israelites, in a sense, start out from, and the world in which they will dwell for the rest of the Torah, which is the world of the desert. Not the rest of the Tanakh, of course, because in the book of Joshua, they come into Israel, which starts another chapter in the saga of the people. But now, Bishalach is the time when they leave Egypt and go to the desert, with the ultimate aim of getting to Israel, but they don't get there, obviously, in the Torah. I mean, by the end of the Torah and the death of Moses, they're still in the desert. And so there is this tremendous narrative break. If you're just thinking about it as a story, this is where the scene changes. And now you have to think not of the slavery of Egypt, but of the vast and empty expanses of the desert. It is always helpful when reading any story to be able to picture the background against which the events are taking place. And now we have to shift our mental scene from the world of Egypt to the vast expanses of the desert. And so I think Sandy's just given in one sentence a sermon that any rabbi would be happy to give. which isn't the reason that we need the Torah, in part because of this unhappiness that we have, because it's supposed to train us in some ways to overcome this natural inclination at dissatisfaction and unhappiness, and train us to gratitude, which is in some ways the fundamental religious emotion. And I would say, yes, that is true. I'm not sure that it works in this instance as well as it does in some others. But as you know, the first prayer one is supposed to say in the morning is Modeh Ani Lefanecha. I am grateful to you, God. And the Torah is a training in gratitude. When you eat something, you're supposed to say a blessing because you're supposed to be grateful. The Talmud says that someone who eats something without making a blessing is a thief, because you're stealing from God the payment, which is the gratitude. And so, yes, it is. I mean, I think that if you lead a seriously religious life, you actually can, in some ways, mitigate the constant dissatisfactions that very self-regarding people tend to give voice to all the time, and it is what we aspire to, but it's hard. It is hard. Clinton raises a really important and significant point about the difference between independence and liberation. The Jews have now been liberated. They're not independent. And I would say independence has two different valences here, a sort of positive and negative one. That is, to be independent, to be able to rely on yourself, not to have a slave mentality, not to think everybody else should give you stuff. That's a function of that is a good kind of independence. And that's a function of something that they don't have here, as Clinton's pointing out, by asking for the men and complaining. If they were more independent, they would be less whiny, as everybody who's ever had kids knows. But there is also an independence that they don't exactly ever attain, and human beings don't ever attain in the Torah, which is that you're not independent in that you are not entirely self-sufficient. You always need guidance, need wisdom, need God. And this is a nice, I just mentioned this to someone the other day. This is a very lovely comment from Heschel, that people both overestimate themselves and underestimate themselves. They overestimate themselves in that they think they can do without God. And that's an overestimation. It's not true. They underestimate themselves in the sense that they believe that God, who is the sovereign of all the universe, couldn't care about little old me, because when I'm a person tucked into a corner of a corner of a corner of a corner with billions of other people around, but that we rise to the level of God's concern, but we do not rise to the level of our own independence of God's guidance and wisdom. And so let me circle back now to where we began with today's class, and that is the vision of Dr. King. I think that it is not sufficiently appreciated and commented on in our day that he was Reverend Martin Luther King, that his vision arose from a deeply religious perspective, and that the civil rights movement in general was a movement that was largely born of the Black church. In fact, when I went to the African American Museum of History in Washington, I was disappointed at how small a part the Black church played in the museum. I think it should have been a bigger part. It's a tremendous museum, by the way. Anybody who goes to Washington must see it. It's very powerful. But the church and the vision of what God wanted, and this idea of liberation, and that all human beings are in God's image, this was central to the civil rights movement, and should be central to our society and covenantal compact. we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Why are they equal? They're equal because they're endowed by their creator. That's why they're equal. I mean, that was the founding idea of America, often violated, and certainly violated at its founding, but an idea that was powerful enough eventually to rise and to overturn the shackles of slavery, because and this did it. The Bible, in its majestic declaration that human beings are in the image of God, and therefore every one of them should be free to serve God in their own way, but also free not to be the servants of other servants, since we're all supposed to be servants of God, not to be enslaved to human beings. And in this time when these issues as I guess in every time are so powerful and painful and contentious, we can, at least all of us, right, left, center, anywhere, hold on to this central and omni-significant truth, which is that that America is supposed to be founded in part on this biblical insight that everyone should be free, because everybody has the divine within them, and therefore is of ultimate worth. And as Lincoln put it, as I would not be a slave, I would not be a master. So I hope that you have a chance to celebrate Dr. King's legacy. It is, authentic cultural heroes are rare in any culture, and they should be elevated and celebrated when they come along. I hope that you will have a chance to, if not plant a tree, acknowledge one, their beauty and what they do for us in the world on Tu Bishvat. And both of those holidays, of course, coincide on Monday, and that you will join us this Shabbat morning for Parsha of Bishop, for the paradigm of liberation from slavery, the Jews' march out of Egypt. And thank you for being with us this morning. Have a good